40 stories that are hard to believe and will blow your mind. Sometimes life comes up with plots so wild that even the craziest movies start to look unimaginative by comparison. Seriously, a girl falls out of a plane from roughly 2 miles up, wakes up in the middle of the jungle, and spends the next 11 days trying to find another human being. A man survives an atomic bombing, makes it home, and 3 days later finds himself in the middle of a second one. And one woman takes a job at sea and somehow ends up serving aboard 3 famous ships, each of which later meets with disaster. And these aren't tall tales. They're not scary stories somebody made up online. They really happened. Today we're going through 40 true stories that are almost impossible to believe. There will be near impossible rescues, bizarre coincidences, decisions that leave you speechless for a moment, and events that raise just one question: how on earth did that happen? So, get comfortable. Turn the volume down a little if you like, put everything else aside, and just listen. And before we begin, subscribe to the channel. I regularly post long, calm stories and lectures here, something to listen to before bed, while you're relaxing, or whenever you just want to step away from the noise of everyday life for a while. Subscribing really helps the channel grow, and honestly, it lets me know that you want more big episodes like this one. All right, let's begin. Story 1. The Girl Who Fell Out of a Plane. In December 1971, 17-year-old Julianne Kopka was flying with her mother from Lima to Pucallpa. They were going to spend Christmas with Julianne's father, who worked at a research station deep in the rainforest. It was supposed to be a short flight, less than an hour, but the plane flew into an extremely violent thunderstorm. Luggage tumbled from the overhead racks, panic spread through the cabin, and then lightning struck the aircraft. The plane broke apart in mid-air. Juliana barely had time to understand what was happening. One second she was sitting beside her mother, the next she was falling toward the earth, still strapped into a row of seats. The drop was roughly 2 miles. The spinning seats probably slowed her descent a little. The canopy and tangled vines softened the impact, too. Juliana woke up on the forest floor with a broken collarbone, an injured knee, and cuts all over her body. One shoe was gone. So were her glasses. There was nothing around her but jungle. No people, no voices. Her parents were zoologists, and her father had once given her a simple piece of advice. If you get lost in the rainforest, find a stream. A stream will lead to a river, and near a river you have a better chance of finding people. Juliana found water and followed it, slowly. She slept on the ground, lived on a few pieces of candy she had found, and listened to search planes flying overhead, planes that couldn't see her through the thick canopy. On the 11th day, she came across a boat and a lumber worker's shelter. The men arrived the following day. At first, they thought the exhausted girl was some kind of spirit from a local legend. Then she spoke to them in Spanish, and everything became clear. They treated her wounds and took her to a doctor. Juliana was the only person on the plane to survive. She later became a biologist and devoted her life to protecting the rainforest, the same rainforest that had nearly killed her and, in the end, had also saved her. Story 2. The Man Who Survived 2 Atomic Bombings. On August 6, 1945, engineer Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on a business trip. That morning he saw an aircraft in the sky, then a few small parachutes, and immediately afterward, a blinding flash. An atomic bomb had been dropped on the city. Yamaguchi was about 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. The blast threw him through the air, burned him badly, and left him temporarily deaf. He spent the night in a shelter. The following day, which already sounds almost impossible in itself, he managed to find a working train and travel home to Nagasaki. His family barely recognized him. His body and face were burned and covered in bandages. Yet, on August 9th, he still went to work. It was wartime. Somehow, even after an entire city had been destroyed, the machinery of ordinary life kept moving. He was telling his supervisor that a single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. The man didn't believe him. How could one device wipe out an entire city? And at that exact moment, white light flooded the room. A second atomic bomb had been dropped, this time on Nagasaki. Yamaguchi dropped to the floor. The walls partly shielded him, and he survived again. His wife and child were near a shelter at the time because they had gone out to find medicine for his burns. They survived too. In other words, his injury in Hiroshima may indirectly have saved his family in Nagasaki. It is a horrifying thought when you stop to consider it. The Japanese government later officially recognized Yamaguchi as a survivor of both atomic bombings. He lived to the age of 93 and spent his later years speaking out against nuclear weapons. He was given 2 nearly impossible second chances, and he used them to make sure people heard what had happened. Story 3. Miss Unsinkable. Violet Jessup worked as a stewardess aboard passenger liners. In 1911, she was serving on the enormous RMS Olympic when it collided with a British warship. The liner was badly damaged, but it managed to return to port. A few months later, Violet was offered a position on a new ship owned by the same company. She wasn't particularly eager to take it, but her friends persuaded her. The new liner was called Titanic. In April 1912, the ship struck an iceberg. Violet was told to go up on deck and stay calm so that passengers who spoke little English could follow her example. She was eventually placed in Lifeboat 16. At the last moment, an officer handed her a baby. She held the child all night. The next morning, aboard the rescue ship, a woman ran up to her, took the baby without a word, and disappeared into the crowd. She was most likely the child's mother. Even after the Titanic sank, Violet went back to sea. During the First World War, she served aboard the hospital ship Britannic, Titanic's younger sister. In 1916, the ship struck a mine. The lifeboats began to be pulled toward the spinning propellers, and Violet had to jump into the water. She hit her head badly, but survived. Doctors later discovered that she had fractured her skull. So she lived through the collision of the Olympic, the sinking of the Titanic, and the loss of the Britannic. And even after all that, she didn't leave the sea. She continued working aboard ships and eventually completed 2 round-the-world voyages. There is a reason people called her Miss Unsinkable. Story 4. The day Boston was flooded with molasses. On January 15, 1919, an enormous molasses tank burst in Boston. It held roughly 2.3 million gallons of thick sugar syrup. People in the neighborhood had known for a long time that something was wrong. The tank leaked. Children scraped sweet drips from its walls, and adults heard creaking and a low, ominous rumble. Was it repaired? Not really. The company essentially painted it brown so that the leaks would be less obvious. Then, the weather suddenly warmed, pressure inside the tank rose, and around lunchtime, there was a sound of tearing metal. The tank exploded. A dark wave several meters high surged through the streets. It moved about as fast as a car, smashed walls, overturned wagons, and even knocked a fire station off its foundation. Then came the nightmare. As the wave slowed, the molasses became thick and sticky. People sank into it and couldn't pull themselves free. Rescuers' shoes stuck to the ground. Stretchers became trapped. 21 people died, and around 150 were injured. Investigators later found serious structural defects, and the tank had never been properly tested. The disaster led to stricter engineering oversight. But perhaps the most disturbing part is this. The danger had stood in the middle of a residential neighborhood for years. It creaked, leaked, and practically announced that something was wrong. And everyone simply got used to it. Story 5. The lake that released an invisible cloud. Lake Nyos in Cameroon lies inside an ancient volcanic crater. Carbon dioxide from deep underground had been slowly seeping into the water and collecting under pressure near the bottom, like an enormous bottle of soda, only the size of a lake. On the evening of August 21st, 1986, the deep water suddenly began to rise. The pressure dropped, and the lake released a vast cloud of carbon dioxide. The gas had no color and almost no smell, and because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, it didn't drift upward. It rolled downhill into the valleys. People lost consciousness without ever understanding what was happening. Many were asleep and simply never woke up. In the morning, everything looked almost normal. The houses were still standing, so were the trees. There had been no fire and no earthquake, only silence. Roughly 1,700 people and thousands of animals died. Naturally, rumors spread at first. A secret weapon, an unknown disease, anything people could imagine. But scientists found an enormous amount of dissolved gas deep in the lake and understood what had happened. The lake had exhaled all at once. Engineers later installed special pipes that bring gas-rich water toward the surface, allowing the carbon dioxide to escape gradually instead of in one deadly release. The story is frightening precisely because the danger couldn't be seen, heard, or sensed in advance. Story 6. 438 Days at Sea. In November 2012, fisherman José Salvador Alvarenga set out from the coast of Mexico with a young crewmate named Ezequiel Córdoba. The plan was simple: fish for a day and come home. Then, a storm hit. The engine failed, the radio battery died, and the small boat was swept into the open Pacific. They caught fish with their bare hands, grabbed seabirds and turtles, and collected rainwater. When there was no rain, things became desperate. And perhaps almost as punishing as the hunger was the monotony. Every day, the same water, the same horizon, and no way to change anything. After several months, Ezequiel became ill and died. Alvarenga was alone. He talked to himself, counted full moons, and watched ships pass in the distance. Once, people on a ship even waved at him and kept going. At one point, he wanted to throw himself overboard. Then he thought of the daughter he had not seen in years. He promised himself that if he survived, he would find her. After 438 days, the boat washed up on one of the Marshall Islands. Alvarenga made his way ashore and eventually reached the home of local residents. Investigators later examined his route and found that it matched the Pacific currents. He had drifted almost all the way across the ocean. After returning home, he reunited with his daughter and delivered his crewmate's final words to the young man's family. Story 7. The Man with an Iron Rod Through His Head. In 1848, railroad foreman Phineas Gage was packing blasting powder into a hole with a long iron tamping rod. A spark ignited the powder, and the 6-kilogram bar shot through his cheek, passed behind one eye, and exited through the top of his skull. The rod landed dozens of meters away. A few minutes later, Gage was speaking. He climbed into a wagon by himself and greeted the doctor with a remark along the lines of, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." And honestly, that sounds almost impossible. He was treated without antibiotics and without anything resembling modern neurosurgery. Doctors cleaned the wound, removed fragments of bone, and fought the infection. His family had essentially begun preparing for the worst, but Phineas started to recover. After the injury, people close to him said he had changed. Before, he had been calm and dependable. Afterward, he became more irritable, blunt, and impulsive. Later accounts probably exaggerated those changes, though. Gage eventually worked as a stagecoach driver, a job that demands memory, self-control, and planning. He lived for almost 12 years after the accident and kept the iron rod with him. His case had a major influence on medicine. It gave doctors one of the earliest vivid demonstrations that the frontal lobes are connected to personality, decision-making, and behavioral control. And his survival was almost miraculous. The iron passed within millimeters of vital blood vessels. Story 8. 69 Days Underground. On August 5, 2010, part of the San Jose mine in Chile collapsed. 33 miners were trapped roughly 700 meters below the surface. Their emergency shelter held almost nothing: a few cans of tuna, some cookies, and a little milk. They immediately imposed strict rules. Everyone received a tiny ration, and the next meal came 2 days later. The mine was hot and humid, and there was no communication with the surface at all. Rescue teams drilled through the rock almost blindly. The first attempts missed. Only on the 17th day did one drill break through the ceiling of a tunnel. The miners painted it red and attached a note: "We are well in the shelter, the 33 of us." After that, water, food, and medicine were lowered through the narrow shaft. Engineers then drilled a wider rescue tunnel and prepared a metal capsule called Phoenix. One by one, the miners were brought to the surface. The last man out was shift supervisor Luis Urzua, the person who had maintained order and rationed the food below. All 33 men survived after 69 days underground. And technology was not the only thing that saved them. During those first weeks, when no one knew whether help would ever come, several dozen frightened people managed not to turn on one another. They made rules and divided the last cans of food fairly. Story 9. The Laughter Epidemic. In January 1962, 3 students at a girls' school in Tanganyika suddenly began laughing and couldn't stop. The attacks lasted for hours, sometimes days. The laughter would turn into crying, anxiety, weakness, and fainting. The condition then appeared in roughly 95 other students. The school closed, but the girls returned home, and the symptoms spread farther. Similar episodes appeared in neighboring villages and other schools. Over the next few months, hundreds of people were affected, and 14 schools had to close temporarily. Doctors tested the water, the food, and the surrounding environment. They found no infection and no toxins. The most plausible explanation is mass psychogenic illness, a genuine physical response to severe stress that can spread through a group without anyone consciously imitating anyone else. The country had only recently gained independence. Discipline in schools remained harsh, and teenagers were expected to adapt quickly to a new reality. It seems the laughter became a strange, uncontrollable release of accumulated pressure. And yes, the phrase laughter epidemic sounds almost funny. But there was nothing funny about it for the people who lived through it. Story 10. 3 days at the bottom of the ocean. In May 2013, Nigerian cook Harrison Okene was working aboard the tugboat Jaskin 4. Before dawn, the vessel capsized and sank near an oil platform. Harrison was thrown into a dark passageway and, feeling his way almost blindly, found a compartment where a pocket of air remained. The vessel came to rest upside down at a depth of about 30 meters. The water reached nearly to his chest. There was no light. The silence alone could have driven a person mad. Okene assembled a small platform from floating debris and spent around 60 hours in the cold water. And even more frightening than the cold was the carbon dioxide. Inside the sealed compartment, the air was slowly turning poisonous. Divers descended to the wreck to recover bodies. One of them saw a hand in the darkness and reached for it. The hand suddenly grabbed him. On the recording, you can hear the diver cry out. Nobody expected to find a living person down there. Okene couldn't be brought straight to the surface because the risk of decompression sickness was too high. He was given a diving helmet, moved into a decompression chamber, and spent several more days slowly returning to normal pressure. Of the 12 crew members, he was the only survivor. And then came a strange, almost unbelievable twist. The man who had spent 3 days trapped in a sunken vessel later became a professional diver himself. Story 11. A fall from more than 6 miles up. In January 1972, a Yugoslav airliner broke apart in the sky over Czechoslovakia. Aboard was 22-year-old flight attendant Vesna Vulovic. A section of the fuselage, with Vesna pinned inside by a food cart, fell from an altitude of more than 10 kilometers. It sounds like a story with no possible chance of survival. But the piece of aircraft landed on a snowy, wooded slope. The branches, the snow, and the angle of impact each absorbed at least some of the force. Vesna was found by a local resident named Bruno Honka, a former military medic. He heard a cry among the wreckage and was able to help before the rescuers arrived. Her injuries were horrific: broken legs, ribs, and vertebrae, as well as a skull injury. She spent several days in a coma, then faced a long recovery and had to learn to walk again. Her memory erased everything connected with the flight and the crash itself, and perhaps that was a kind of mercy. Vesna later returned to the airline, though she worked on the ground. Her case entered Guinness World Records as the highest fall without a parachute survived by a human being. She never considered herself a hero. She simply said, "I don't remember anything, so I didn't have time to be afraid." Sometimes a life depends on very strange things: a few trees, deep snow, and someone nearby who knows first aid. Story 12. The Palace Built by a Postman. French postman Ferdinand Cheval walked dozens of kilometers through the countryside every day delivering letters. In the spring of 1879, he tripped over a stone with an unusually strange shape. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and took it home. The next day he found several more. That was the beginning of a story that everyone around him initially dismissed as an eccentric whim. For 33 years, Cheval collected stones along his route. At first, he stuffed them into his pockets. Then he carried a basket. Eventually, he pushed a wheelbarrow. In the evenings, after work, he joined his finds with lime and cement. He had no degree, no formal plans, and no obvious system. Yet, little by little, an enormous fantasy palace appeared, with towers, temples, animals, waterfalls, and figures that seemed to have been assembled from different religions, different eras, and other people's dreams. The neighbors laughed. He kept going. He called it the Ideal Palace and worked at night by the light of a kerosene lamp. When he finally finished, he was already over 70. He wanted to be buried inside it, but the authorities refused. So, without making much of a fuss, he spent another 8 years building himself a separate tomb in the cemetery. Today, the Ideal Palace is protected as an architectural monument, and Cheval is remembered as one of the most remarkable masters of naive art. There is something stubbornly hopeful in his story. Sometimes a great undertaking really does not require connections or status. Sometimes all it takes is a stone, a wheelbarrow, and the habit of returning to your madness every single evening. Story 13. The Man Who Gave Away Safe Milk. At the end of the 19th century, American businessman Nathan Strauss owned major department stores and could easily have focused on nothing but business. But he was deeply affected by the number of babies dying in New York's poorest neighborhoods. One of the causes sounded painfully ordinary: raw milk. It spoiled quickly, was transported without refrigeration, and became a breeding ground for tuberculosis, typhoid, and other infections. At the time, many people dismissed pasteurization as unnecessary nonsense. Strauss did not waste much time arguing in theory. He invested his own money in milk stations where poor families could receive clean, pasteurized milk for almost nothing. He opened stations in crowded neighborhoods, hired doctors and nurses, and taught mothers how to store infant food safely. When public officials were slow to help, he paid for it himself. The effect was too obvious to ignore. In neighborhoods served by the stations, infant mortality dropped sharply. Gradually, pasteurization stopped being a controversial idea and became the norm. Strauss spent much of his fortune on the program and said that money used to save children was far more useful than money sitting idle in a bank. There are no stunts here, no spectacular disaster, no dramatic spectacle. Yet the story is still powerful. One man noticed a dull technical detail, the temperature at which milk was treated, and understood that thousands of lives were hidden behind it. Quite often, it is not a grand speech that makes the difference. It is a clean bottle placed on the table at the right time. Story 14. The school teacher who went over Niagara Falls in a barrel. In 1901, American schoolteacher Annie Edson Taylor was 63 years old and nearly out of money. She decided to become famous in a way that seemed, even then, to put it mildly, completely wild. She would be the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. A custom oak barrel was made for her with metal hoops and a mattress inside. Before the main attempt, a cat was sent over the falls in it. The cat survived. It was probably not delighted by the experience, but it survived. On October 24th, Annie climbed in, assistants pumped air into the barrel with a bicycle pump, and the hatch was sealed. From there, the current carried her toward the edge. For several minutes, the barrel vanished in the spray. Then it appeared below the falls. Annie was pulled out alive. She had a wound on her head, but no major injuries. Surely, you might think, fame would now provide her with a comfortable old age. It did not. Her manager disappeared with the barrel, the public appearances brought in little money, and Annie spent a good portion of what she earned trying to recover her stolen prop. For the rest of her life, she warned others not to repeat the stunt. And that is probably the whole point of the story. Surviving Niagara Falls in a wooden barrel turned out to be easier than figuring out how to live an ordinary life afterward. Story 15. The soldier who did not believe the war was over. In 1944, Japanese officer Hiroo Onoda was sent to the Philippine island of Lubang. His orders were short and brutal: conduct guerrilla warfare, never surrender, and never take his own life. A few months later, the war ended. But Onoda and his comrades decided that leaflets announcing Japan's surrender were enemy propaganda. What followed was almost impossible to imagine. Years in the jungle, constant hiding. They found food however they could and attacked local residents, believing them to be enemy collaborators. There is no way to turn this into a clean, heroic legend. Real people died and suffered because of that loyalty to an order. One by one, Onoda's companions surrendered or were killed. Eventually, he was alone. In 1974, a young traveler named Norio Suzuki found him. Onoda agreed to lay down his arms on one condition. His former commanding officer had to personally relieve him of duty. The retired major was found in Japan and brought to the island. Now an elderly man, he formally read the order. Only then, almost 30 years after the war had ended, did Onoda surrender his sword and still functioning rifle. This is not really a story about heroism. It is a story about how completely a person can lock himself inside one picture of the world. When every piece of contrary evidence looks like a lie, reality itself loses its authority. A war can end for governments, armies, and newspapers, and keep going for decades inside one person's mind. Story 16. The Doctor Who Drank Bacteria. When Australian doctors Barry Marshall and Robin Warren suggested that stomach ulcers were caused by bacteria, the medical establishment looked at them with deep skepticism. The accepted belief was that microbes could not survive in stomach acid, and that ulcers were mainly caused by stress, spicy food, nerves, and lifestyle. Marshall tried to prove the idea through research, but suitable models were difficult to find. Then, in 1984, he took a step that almost any modern ethics committee would reject immediately. He drank a culture of Helicobacter pylori, grown from a patient's sample. Within days, he developed nausea, bad breath, and inflammation of the stomach lining. A biopsy revealed the bacteria. Marshall later treated himself with antibiotics, and the experiment became a powerful argument that many ulcers were not a reflection of a person's temperament at all. They were linked to an infection, and that meant they could be treated. It took years for medical recommendations to truly change. In 2005, Marshall and Warren received the Nobel Prize. And no, nobody should repeat an experiment like that. It was risky and could have ended far worse, but the change in perspective is still extraordinary. For years, patients had been told to calm down and watch their diet, while the real cause lived quietly inside their stomachs. Sometimes a scientific revolution begins with the words, "That's impossible," and one extremely stubborn doctor holding a glass of bacteria. Story 17. 17 Days Beneath the Rubble. On April 24, 2013, the 8-story Rana Plaza complex in Bangladesh collapsed. The building housed several garment factories. Cracks had been noticed in advance, but workers were still ordered to report for their shifts. More than 1,000 people died. The rescue operation soon became an operation to recover bodies and clear wreckage. Then, 17 days after the collapse, workers heard a faint sound. Under a concrete slab, they found a young garment worker named Reshma Begum. She had been trapped inside a small pocket of air. There was a little water and some dry food nearby. When it ran out, she drank rainwater that seeped through the cracks. Rescuers widened the opening with extreme care and finally carried her out on a stretcher. The crowd greeted Reshma with shouts and applause. After 17 days in darkness, she saw daylight again and asked for water. News of her rescue traveled around the world, but the miracle can easily hide the most important part. These people did not die because of a freak act of nature. The danger had been seen beforehand. Production was simply treated as more important than safety. That is why Reshma's story offers hope and leaves such a bitter aftertaste at the same time. The human body really can endure the nearly impossible. The other question is why it was ever forced to do so. Story 18. The twins who lived the same life. The identical twins, later known as the Jim twins, were separated shortly after birth in Ohio. They were adopted by different families, and both were named James. That is already odd enough. They grew up about 70 kilometers apart and did not meet until they were 39. When researchers compared their lives, the coincidences seemed almost indecently excessive. Both had childhood dogs named Toy. Both worked as deputy sheriffs, enjoyed woodworking, drove similar cars, and vacationed at the same beach in Florida. Both first married women named Linda, divorced, and then married women named Betty. Even their sons had nearly identical names, James Allen and James Allen. Not every detail of the story is equally well documented, and of course the human brain loves to grab onto coincidences while ignoring differences. Still, the similarity in the separated twins' habits, tastes, and behavior became important material in the study of heredity. The story of the two Jims does not prove that fate is written in advance. Environment, chance, and personal choice have not disappeared. But it does show how quietly biology may participate in our preferences and reactions. Perhaps some of what we think of as intensely personal began long before our first conscious decision. Our favorite activities, our sense of humor, maybe even the way we hold a cup. Story 19. The city that danced to exhaustion. In the summer of 1518, a woman identified in the chronicles as Frau Trophea stepped into a street in Strasbourg and began to dance. There was no music, she simply danced for hours. Then she continued the next day. Soon, dozens of people joined her and, according to some accounts, eventually hundreds. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, fell to the ground, and injured themselves. City officials decided that the afflicted needed to dance it out, so they provided halls and even hired musicians, and yes, it only made things worse. Later, the dancers were taken to a religious shrine, and the outbreak gradually subsided. Historians still debate how many people were involved and whether anyone died. The most widely accepted explanation is mass psychogenic illness brought on by overwhelming stress. The region was suffering from hunger, disease, and religious fear. Sometimes, pressure escapes through the body. In fainting, seizures, fits of laughter, or uncontrolled movement. Try to picture the scene at night. An ordinary street, houses, windows, and people who cannot stop moving. We like to think behavior is something deeply individual, but emotions travel between people much faster than we realize. That is what the Strasbourg dancing plague seems to reveal. A human being is not a sealed system. Sometimes one body's fear is picked up by another, then a third, and before long, an entire city is moving to the same anxious rhythm. Story 20. The Boy Who Found Home on a Satellite Map. When he was 5 years old, an Indian boy named Saru went with his older brother to look for work. At a railway station, he fell asleep in an empty carriage. When he woke up, the train was moving and the doors were locked. Many hours later, it carried him to Calcutta, almost 1,500 kilometers from home. Saru did not know the name of his hometown, or even his surname. For a while, he lived on the streets. Then he was placed in an orphanage and eventually adopted by a family in Australia. He grew up in safety, but fragments remained in his memory. A water tower, a bridge, a station, the road to his house. Years later, Saru opened Google Earth and began searching railway lines by hand. He estimated how many hours he had spent on the train, calculated a possible radius, and spent evening after evening staring at endless stations on the screen. The search went on for years. Then, one landscape suddenly felt familiar. He found the water tower, the bridge, and streets that matched his childhood memories. In 2012, Saru traveled to India, walked down the road he remembered, and found his mother. She had never moved away because she kept hoping that one day her son would return. They were no longer able to speak the same language fluently, but that hardly seemed to matter. Technology did not replace memory in this story. It simply gave memory a map. Billions of pixels, a railway line, and a handful of images carried in the mind of a 5-year-old came together 25 years later. Sometimes the road home really does begin with someone staring at the earth from above for a very long time. Story 21. Struck by lightning 7 times. Roy Sullivan worked as a park ranger in Shenandoah National Park in the United States. According to official records, he was struck by lightning 7 times, and he survived every single one. The first strike injured his leg. Another bolt entered through the window of his vehicle and burned off his eyebrows and hair. Later came burns to his shoulder, damaged shoes, and hair catching fire all over again. At some point, Roy started carrying a container of water so that he could put himself out quickly. It sounds like black comedy, but it was real. Once, he saw a storm cloud, tried to drive away from it, and was struck after he got out of the vehicle. The odds of such a series seem absurd, but Sullivan spent years working outdoors in the mountains, where thunderstorms were common. His risk in each individual storm was higher than that of someone who spent most of the day indoors. And when a rare event happens repeatedly, it is not a failure of probability. It is probability working with complete indifference over a very long stretch of time. Roy himself was terrified of storms and believed lightning was pursuing him. People reportedly kept their distance from him whenever clouds gathered. The story sounds almost funny until you try to imagine living with the constant expectation of the next strike. Probability is calm on paper. For a real person, it can mean 7 flashes directly overhead. Story 22. The Woman Left Alone in the Arctic. In 1921, an expedition traveled to Wrangel Island to claim the territory. The group consisted of 4 men and a young Inupiat woman named Ada Blackjack, hired as a seamstress and cook. She accepted the job to pay for her son's medical treatment and, frankly, was hardly prepared to survive alone in a polar wilderness. The supply plan failed. One member of the expedition became seriously ill, and 3 others set out across the ice to find help and disappeared. Ada remained in camp with the sick man, Lorne Knight. She cared for him but could not save him. After his death, her only companion was the expedition's cat, Vic. The woman everyone considered the least prepared member of the group learned to set traps, shoot, repair clothing, and defend herself from polar bears. She even photographed herself so there would be evidence that all of this had happened. She kept the camp running until a rescue vessel arrived. Ada spent several months completely alone, and the ordeal as a whole lasted nearly 2 years. Newspapers later called her a female Robinson Crusoe. Ada herself was not especially interested in fame. She wanted money and a chance to return to her children. Perhaps that is why the story is so affecting. The hero never performs heroism. Ada simply does the next necessary thing. Light the fire, set a trap, feed the cat, survive the night. Sometimes survival is not one enormous act of courage. It is hundreds of small decisions not to give up. At least, not today. Story 23. The Man They Could Not Kill. During Prohibition in New York, a homeless man named Michael Malloy often visited a bar and drank on credit. 5 acquaintances decided to profit from him. They took out life insurance policies in his name and planned to arrange an accidental death. At first, the scheme seemed foolproof. They gave him unlimited credit at the bar, expecting him to drink himself to death. But Malloy drank and kept coming back. So they mixed antifreeze, turpentine, and other poisons into his alcohol. He survived. They served him spoiled oysters and poisoned sandwiches. Again, he returned to the bar. In the middle of winter, they got him drunk, drove him to a park, stripped him, and poured water over him. The next day, Michael appeared once more and asked for a drink. Then they became even more brutal. They arranged for a car to run him down, but after several weeks, he recovered. In the end, the conspirators killed him with gas. By then, however, the insurance company was suspicious. Malloy's body was exhumed, the scheme was uncovered, and the men were convicted. Several were executed. Michael later became known as Mike the Durable. Yet behind the almost comic sequence of failed attempts lies something very dark. A vulnerable man was treated as something disposable for the sake of money. His extraordinary resilience did not save him in the end. But in a sense, it gave investigators time. There were too many attempts and too many traces. Sometimes a body holds on to life longer than evil expects it to. Story 24. 133 Days on a Raft. In 1942, Chinese sailor Poon Lim was serving aboard a British merchant ship when it was torpedoed by a German submarine. The vessel sank within minutes. Poon managed to put on a life jacket and spent several hours in the water before he found a wooden life raft. The raft held water, biscuits, chocolate, sugar, and flares. Poon began rationing the supplies immediately. When the food ran out, he made a fish hook from wire, a line from rope fibers, caught fish, and collected rainwater. Later, he managed to catch a bird. Once, he even caught a small shark. To keep track of time, he first tied knots in a cord. Later, he counted full moons. He saw ships, but they passed him by. An aircraft spotted him once, but a storm prevented a rescue. Only after 133 days did the raft reach the coast of Brazil, where fishermen found him. Poon had lost a great deal of weight, but he was able to walk without assistance. When he was told that he had set a record for solitary survival on a raft, his response was roughly, "I hope no one ever has to break it." And that may be the whole meaning of the story. It is not only the length of time that is astonishing, though 133 days is extraordinary. It is how calmly he kept thinking. In the middle of the ocean, he could not control the wind, the current, or passing ships. Nothing large. But he could decide how much water to drink that day, how to repair his fishing line, and what to finish before dark. Sometimes, that tiny piece of control is enough to survive one more day, then another, and another. 133 times in a row. Story 25. The Woman Who Solved Her Own Kidnapping. Carlina White grew up with a family in Connecticut, but from childhood she felt that something did not add up. The woman who called herself Carlina's mother could not produce a birth certificate, avoided direct questions, and did not look much like her. When Carlina had a daughter of her own, the feeling became stronger. She began searching online for stories about missing children and found a website containing photographs of babies who had disappeared years earlier. One was a 19-day-old girl abducted from a New York hospital in 1987, along with an age-progressed image of what she might look like as an adult. The resemblance was too strong to dismiss. Carlina contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and then reached out to her biological family. A DNA test confirmed it. She was the missing baby. The woman who raised her had disguised herself as a hospital worker, kidnapped Carlina, and brought her up as her own child. After 23 years, Carlina's parents learned that their daughter was alive. But what followed was not like a movie. Carlina had to rebuild her identity piece by piece and form relationships with people who were family by blood, but strangers by experience. She found her family and, in a sense, lost the former version of herself. The most striking part may be that quiet sense of mismatch, something barely noticeable, a thought with no proof. Something is wrong here. Yet it survived years of deception and eventually led her to a photograph in which she suddenly recognized herself. Story 26. The Man Who Woke Up in a Body Bag. In 2014, 78-year-old Walter Williams of Mississippi was pronounced dead. A medical worker could find no pulse, the paperwork was completed, and his body was taken to a funeral home and placed in a bag. Then the staff noticed the bag moving. Walter began breathing and kicking. He was rushed to a hospital. Doctors believed his pacemaker may have temporarily stopped working and then restarted his heart. His family had already endured one terrible phone call telling them he was dead. Almost immediately, they received another. He was alive. Walter talked, ate, and spent about 2 more weeks with his family. Then he died for real. It sounds like something from a horror film, but there was nothing supernatural about it. Confirming a death outside a hospital is not always as obvious as people assume. An extremely weak pulse, low body temperature, medication, or equipment failure can all lead to a mistake. That is why strict protocols, repeated checks, and all that seemingly excessive caution exist. For his family, those extra days were both a gift and another blow. He had literally returned from the threshold of his own funeral, but only briefly. Sometimes a miracle does not undo anything. It simply gives you a little more time. Story 27. The Woman Hit by a Meteorite. On November 30th, 1954, Ann Hodges was dozing on a sofa in her home in Alabama. At that moment, a brilliant fireball streaked across the sky. A stony meteorite crashed through the roof, bounced off a radio, and struck Ann in the side. She was left with a huge bruise but survived. It is considered the first well-documented case of a human being injured by an object from space. The scale of the coincidence is almost absurd. A rock travels through space. It survives entry into the atmosphere. It breaks apart. One fragment finds one particular house, penetrates one particular roof, and hits a person who was simply lying on a sofa. Then came a thoroughly earthly problem, an argument over ownership. The house was rented, and the landlady claimed that the meteorite was part of the property. Ann considered it hers, since it had nearly killed her. The family eventually kept the rock, but they were unable to sell it for much money. It was later donated to a museum. The publicity exhausted Ann. A story that might have made someone famous instead brought her stress, reporters, and legal disputes. There is a strange irony in that. The gift from space turned out to be a heavy burden in every possible sense. Whenever someone says the odds are astronomically small, Ann Hodges' story is a reminder that small does not mean zero. Story 28. 70 years inside an iron lung. In the summer of 1952, 6-year-old Paul Alexander contracted polio. The virus paralyzed the muscles he needed to breathe, and he was placed inside a metal chamber known as an iron lung. The machine changed the air pressure around his body and forced his chest to rise and fall. Many people were certain he would not live long, but Paul learned a special breathing technique that allowed him to leave the machine for short periods. He finished school, attended university, and became a lawyer. He worked with clients and wrote a book, even though he spent most of his life inside a metal cylinder with only his head visible from the outside. When more modern methods of ventilation became available, he still preferred the machine he knew. By then, iron lungs had almost disappeared. Parts had to be hunted down or made especially for him. Volunteers helped keep the mid-20th century machine working. Paul lived for 7 more decades after his diagnosis and died in 2024. What is most astonishing is not the machine or even the medical rarity. It is the size of the life that unfolded inside such a small physical space. Paul never pretended that it was easy. He did not deny the severity of his condition. He simply refused to accept that a metal cylinder defined the limits of who he could become. Story 29. 6 teenagers on a deserted island. In 1965, 6 teenagers from a boarding school on the Tongan island of Tongatapu decided to run away and sail to Fiji. They took a small boat, a little food, and almost no real sailing experience. A storm struck during the night, the sail and rudder broke, and the boat drifted out into the ocean. 8 days later, they reached the uninhabited island of Ata. What happened next was nothing like the plot of a grim novel about children without adults. The boys divided up responsibilities, planted a garden, collected rainwater, kept a fire burning, and built shelter. If 2 of them argued, they were sent to opposite sides of the island until they had cooled down. One of the boys broke his leg. The others made a splint and cared for him until the bone healed. They prayed, sang, exercised, and made sure nobody was left alone for too long. They were rescued by Australian fisherman Peter Warner. He noticed a burned patch of grass on an island believed to be uninhabited. As he approached, he saw a teenager swimming toward the vessel. It later turned out that all 6 boys had long since been presumed dead. They survived not because every one of them was some kind of superhero. They survived because they created rules that kept ordinary people from falling apart and helped them remain a team. That may be what makes the story so powerful. With no adults, no law, and no supervision, they did not descend into savagery. They drew up a duty roster. Story 30. 2 years in the ice, and not one man lost. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton planned to cross Antarctica. The expedition failed almost immediately. His ship, Endurance, became trapped in pack ice before the crew could even land. For months, they lived aboard the motionless vessel until the pressure crushed its hull. Then, the men moved their supplies and lifeboats onto the ice and watched their ship sink. What followed pushed the edge of what seemed possible. First, they drifted on an ice floe. Then they crossed open water in lifeboats and reached the deserted Elephant Island. From there, Shackleton selected 5 men and set out in a small boat for South Georgia, roughly 800 miles across one of the most vicious stretches of ocean on Earth. After 17 days of storms, they reached the island but landed on the uninhabited side. Shackleton and 2 companions crossed mountains and glaciers without proper equipment, following a route no one had ever traveled before. They reached a whaling station, and Shackleton immediately began organizing a rescue for the men left behind. The weather defeated several attempts, but in August 1916, a ship finally reached Elephant Island. All 22 men waiting there were still alive. The ship was lost. The goal of the expedition was lost too, but the entire crew was saved. Sometimes success does not look like a flag planted at the planned destination. Sometimes it looks like a roll call in which someone answers to every name. Story 31. The man who won the lottery twice, the second time on camera. Australian Bill Morgan was involved in a car accident. Then he suffered a severe allergic reaction to medication, his heart stopped, and he spent nearly 2 weeks in a coma. To put it mildly, the doctors were not sure he would ever wake up. But he did. He recovered, proposed to his girlfriend, and began living his life again. Then, he bought a lottery ticket and won a car. A local television station became interested because the story was already so cinematic. The reporters asked Bill to buy another ticket and scratch it on camera, simply to recreate the moment of his first win. He scratches the ticket, looks at it, goes silent. Then he says he has just won 250,000 Australian dollars. At first, the film crew assumes he is joking. He is not. The ticket is real, and the camera has accidentally captured his second win, this time with no reenactment at all. Then he calls his fiancée and can barely find the words. You can understand why. In a very short time, this man had survived cardiac arrest, awakened from a coma, won a car, and then won $250,000. It is almost too much. Life is not required to compensate for suffering with good luck. Usually, it does not. What makes the footage so mesmerizing is the moment when Bill himself realizes that yes, this is actually happening. If the scene had been written into a movie, audiences would probably have rolled their eyes. It would have seemed too convenient. Story 32. The Lake That Vanished Down a Hole. In November 1980, a drilling crew was working on Lake Peigneur in Louisiana when the drill suddenly dropped into empty space. Apparently, because of an error in the coordinates, it had punctured the roof of a salt mine beneath the lake. At first, a whirlpool appeared on the surface. Then it grew, pulling in the drilling platform, barges, trees, and chunks of shoreline. The lake was shallow, but the opening into the mine acted like a drain in a bathtub. Even the canal that normally carried water toward the Gulf of Mexico reversed direction. Seawater began flowing back into the lake, creating, for a time, a waterfall dozens of meters high. In Louisiana, it was almost surreal. Workers were inside the mine when it happened. They heard the roar and escaped through an emergency route. The people on the platforms survived too. And honestly, that may be the most astonishing part. Despite the scale of the disaster, not a single person was killed. Some of the sunken barges even rose back to the surface after the water levels stabilized. The accident transformed a shallow freshwater lake into a deep saltwater one. The ecosystem changed. Part of the landscape simply vanished. One small error on a map, and suddenly the geography is different. Literally. A drill is lowered a few meters from the intended spot. The flow of a river reverses, islands disappear, and a lake starts devouring its own shoreline. Story 33. 6 days with a nail in his head. Construction worker Patrick Lawler developed a toothache and noticed that his vision was getting worse. For several days he endured it, tried to manage the pain, and even visited a dentist. Only when his condition became much worse did doctors take an X-ray and discover a nail about 4 inches long that had entered through his mouth and lodged in his skull. 6 days earlier, Patrick had been using a nail gun. The tool kicked back, but he assumed he had only damaged a tooth. The nail had entered beside his eye, and there was almost nothing visible from the outside. Somehow, it missed major blood vessels and critical areas of the brain. The operation lasted several hours. Surgeons carefully removed the metal, and Patrick recovered. Later, he joked that his wife finally had proof that he really was hard-headed. The strangest part is the mismatch between reality and sensation. You would imagine that a nail in the skull must feel like an immediate catastrophe. Instead, the body says, "Well, this seems like a toothache." The nervous system does not provide us with an honest map of what is broken. It sends signals, and the brain tries to interpret them using familiar patterns. Sometimes the most dangerous problem disguises itself as something completely ordinary. That is why strange, persistent pain is not a test of heroic endurance. It is a reason to find out what is actually happening. Story 34. The Kentucky Meat Shower. On March 3, 1876, a woman in Kentucky stepped outside and saw pieces of meat falling from a clear sky. They covered an area roughly the size of a yard. There was no storm and no obvious explanation, just meat falling from above. Samples were sent to scientists, and the usual human chaos followed. Some said the material was lung tissue, others identified cartilage or muscle. There were theories involving atmospheric whirlwinds, strange substances, and supernatural signs. According to newspaper reports, 2 men actually tasted the pieces and decided they resembled mutton or venison, because apparently someone had to. The most convincing modern explanation involves vultures. When frightened, these birds can vomit up the contents of their stomachs to reduce their weight and take flight more quickly. A flock may have passed over the property, creating an extremely unpleasant rain. We will probably never reconstruct the event with complete certainty, but the vulture theory explains both the type of tissue and the limited area over which it fell. It is a perfect example of how a rare natural event becomes a legend within hours if no one sees its beginning. A mystery is left on the ground, along with several people who, for some reason, decide to taste it. Story 35. A 5-kilometer fall without a parachute. In March 1944, British air gunner Nicholas Alcomade was returning from a bombing raid over Germany. His aircraft caught fire and began to fall. His parachute had been damaged. He was left with 2 choices: burn inside the plane or jump with no realistic chance of survival. He jumped from an altitude of roughly 5.5 kilometers. He fell through the night sky and probably lost consciousness. Below him was a forest. The flexible branches of spruce trees slowed him down, and deep, loose snow absorbed the remaining force of the impact. When Nicholas regained consciousness, he could move. He had burns, cuts, and a sprained leg, but no major fractures. He lit a cigarette and began calling for help. The German soldiers who found him did not believe his story at first. Then they discovered the wreckage of the aircraft and confirmed that his parachute had indeed remained inside. They even gave him a document certifying what had happened. After the war, Alcomade returned to ordinary life and lived into his 60s. He was not saved by a violation of the laws of nature. He was saved by an absurdly rare combination of them: his body position, flexible branches, snow, and the slope of the ground. Each element removed a little of the energy of the fall. Sometimes that is what a miracle looks like. Not magic, but a nearly impossible combination that for some reason works in one person's favor. Story 36. The pen that helped 2 men leave the moon. After the first moon landing, Buzz Aldrin noticed a small piece of plastic on the floor of the lunar module. It was the tip of a circuit breaker switch connected to power for the ascent engine. It had probably been broken off by a bulky spacesuit in the cramped cabin. The situation was not ideal. If the engine failed to start, Aldrin and Neil Armstrong would not be able to leave the moon and rendezvous with Michael Collins in orbit. A finger could not reach into the opening, and using a metal object risked causing a short circuit. Aldrin looked around and used a felt-tip pen. Its plastic body fit the opening and allowed him to press the mechanism. The engine started normally. The pen did not exactly repair the spacecraft, as the story is sometimes retold, but at the crucial moment, it allowed him to perform a critical action. There is something beautiful in that. Hundreds of thousands of people, extraordinarily complex calculations, and billions of dollars stood behind the mission. Yet at one very specific moment, a broken switch stood between 2 astronauts and the journey home, and the solution was a felt-tip pen. The more complex a system is, the more striking moments like this become. Moments when everything depends not on grandeur, but on a simple object familiar to any schoolchild. Story 37. 80 Minutes Beneath the Ice. In 1999, Swedish Dr. Anna Bogenholm was skiing in Norway when she fell through the ice of a frozen stream. The current pulled her beneath the surface. Her body became wedged between rocks, while a small pocket of air remained near her face. Her friends held on to her skis and called for help, but they could not pull her free. After roughly 40 minutes, the air pocket disappeared and she lost consciousness. Altogether, Anna spent about 80 minutes under the ice. When rescuers finally freed her, her heart had stopped, and her body temperature had fallen to 13.7 degrees Celsius. It was one of the lowest recorded temperatures in an adult who survived. At the hospital, her blood was gradually warmed using a heart-lung machine. Several hours later, her heart began beating again. Movement and sensation eventually returned, and Anna went back to work as a doctor. That may be the most astonishing part. The cold nearly killed her, but it also saved her by slowing her metabolism and protecting her brain from oxygen deprivation. That is why emergency medicine follows a strict principle. A person with severe hypothermia is not considered dead until they have been warmed and resuscitation has clearly failed. It sounds like someone returning from the dead, but it is physiology, precise, and deeply strange. Story 38. The Ghost Ship. Mary Celeste. In December 1872, the ship Dei Gratia encountered the brigantine Mary Celeste in the Atlantic. She was sailing erratically and did not respond to signals. Sailors boarded her and found a largely intact, seaworthy ship. The cargo was there, personal belongings were there, but the captain, his family, and the entire crew had vanished. The lifeboat was gone, as were some navigation instruments. There was water in the hold, but the vessel was not in danger of sinking. Mary Celeste was carrying industrial alcohol, and several barrels were empty or damaged. No bodies were ever found. Then, as so often happens, newspapers embellished everything. They wrote about hot food left on the table and a perfectly untouched ship, hinting at the supernatural. The real scene was disturbing enough. Based on the logs and the condition of the vessel, a completely ordinary explanation is possible. The captain may have feared alcohol fumes, or believed there was too much water in the hold. The people boarded the lifeboat, tied it to the ship with a line, and apparently intended to wait nearby. Then the line broke. The wind carried Mary Celeste away, and the lifeboat disappeared. We will probably never know the exact sequence of events, and it is that missing final piece that turned the story into a legend. The supernatural is not always necessary. Sometimes an empty deck, a missing boat, and one decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time are enough. Story 39. 58 Hours in a Narrow Well. In October 1987, 18-month-old Jessica McClure was playing in a yard in Texas when she fell into an abandoned well only about 20 centimeters wide. She became trapped roughly 7 meters below the surface with one leg pinned above her head. Rescuers could not simply widen the opening. The surrounding rock might collapse and kill her. Instead, they began drilling a large vertical shaft beside the well and then a horizontal tunnel to connect with it. Progress was painfully slow. The rock was harder than expected, equipment broke, and the hours passed. Air was pumped down through a narrow pipe. Rescuers could hear Jessica crying and, at times, singing a children's song. Almost the entire operation was broadcast live. The world watched as people tried to bring one child back from underground. After 58 hours, rescuer Robert O'Donnell reached the little girl and carefully freed her. Images of Jessica being lifted to the surface seemed to appear everywhere. Doctors saved her leg, though she later required several operations. Jessica herself remembers almost nothing. Her family tried to give her an ordinary life without the permanent label of the girl in the well. But many adults never forgot the rescue. They remember where they were when they saw her face. Perhaps it was because this was one of the first moments when millions of people waited for exactly the same thing, for a child beneath the ground simply to take another breath. Story 40. Mark Twain and Halley's Comet. Mark Twain was born in November 1835, shortly after the appearance of Halley's Comet. The comet returns to the Sun roughly once every 76 years, so most people have a chance to see it only once. In 1909, Twain said that he had come into the world with the comet and expected to go out with it too. In his usual style, he joked that the Almighty must have decided, "Here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, and they must go out together." The comet passed perihelion again on April 20th, 1910. Mark Twain died of a heart attack the following day. He was 74. No, the comet did not control his fate. It was a coincidence. But it was a coincidence to which Twain had given meaning in advance, and he did so with an unerring sense of an ending. That is why the story stays with us. A human life is tiny against the scale of celestial cycles, and yet sometimes one biography seems to fit perfectly between two appearances of the same glowing traveler. We began with people falling from the sky, surviving the ocean, living beneath ice and earth, enduring lightning strikes, meteorites, and even a flood of molasses. We end with a man who simply looked up at the sky and seemed to write the final line of his own story in advance. If this were a novel, an editor might have asked for an ending that was a little less perfect. Life chose not to revise it. And that is it. 40 stories that are hard to believe. Over the last 100 minutes, we have fallen from airplanes, drifted across oceans, escaped from mines and collapsed buildings, survived lightning, meteorites, and events that sound like something invented by a novelist. And every time, reality turned out to be stranger. Yet behind almost every one of these miracles was not magic, but physics, chance, preparation, help from another person, and ordinary human stubbornness. Someone held on for one more day at sea. Someone kept a fire alive. Someone heard a faint knock beneath the concrete. Someone simply refused to accept that a thing was impossible. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a like. Tell me in the comments which story surprised you most, and subscribe to the channel. We will return again and again to real events that make even the wildest imagination seem too cautious. And now, you can let yourself exhale. Get comfortable. Take a slow breath in, and let it out just as calmly. Let all these unbelievable stories remain somewhere out there, on the other side of the screen. Thank you for spending this time with me. Good night, and sleep well.